It was exactly 1 week before my grandson's 18th birthday. He was leaning casually against my spacious kitchen island, looked me in the eye and said, "Grandma, the best birthday gift you could ever give me is to hurry up and pass away so we can finally split your money." Orch. The very next morning, I dissolved the family trust, completely disinherited every single relative, and vanished from their lives without a word. The single document I left resting on his desk shattered the entire family. I am so glad you are here to listen. Please follow my story through to the very end, and if you would like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far my story travels. Orch. My name is Dolores. I am 66 years old and live in an affluent suburb in Illinois. Ever since my husband Harold passed away 5 years ago, I truly believed I was building something beautiful with my family. I thought the love I poured into them, the sacrifices I made, and the endless dollars I handed out were solid investments in a bond that mattered above all else. I was dead wrong. Orch. You know what, Grandma? The best birthday present you could give me is to hurry up and pass away so we can just split the money. Those exact words came straight from my 17-year-old grandson, Axel. He was slouched lazily on a high stool at my kitchen counter, eating cereal out of a bone china bowl that cost more than some Americans make in an entire week. Orch. He said it so casually, as if he were just commenting on the weather in Chicago. As he spoke, his silver spoon clinked against the delicate porcelain. That tiny sound echoed in my chest like a funeral bell. I was standing at the stove, making his favorite blueberry pancakes. I had genuinely believed this would be a warm, cozy breakfast between a grandmother and her grandson. Orch. The batter was mixed just right, and the pan was at the perfect temperature. Steam rose from the skillet, carrying the comforting aroma of vanilla and butter that usually filled the kitchen with warmth. In an instant, everything went ice cold. My hand froze on the spatula. The pancake I was about to flip landed back in the pan with a dull, heavy thud. I felt something shatter deep inside me. Orch. It was not the sound of breaking glass. It was like ice suddenly freezing solid in my veins. For 66 years, I held on to the belief that family was sacred. I believed blood was thicker than water, and that the ties of family were unbreakable. I believed true love existed among the people who shared your last name and your history. Orch. What did you just say? I turned around, my voice barely above a whisper. Axel did not even bother to look up from his iPhone screen. His thumb was swiping rapidly, probably calculating how much he stood to inherit once I was gone. Dark hair fell across his forehead, making him look just like his grandfather Harold when he was young. But there was not a trace of Harold's warmth in those eyes. Orch. His eyes were cold, calculating, and predatory. "Oh, come on, Grandma. Don't act so shocked. We all know you're getting up there in age. Mom and Dad talk all the time about how much we're going to get when you're gone. You've lived a full life already." The sheer casual cruelty of it took my breath away. This was the boy I helped raise. Orch. The boy I took to Major League Baseball games and bought expensive cleats for. The boy whose costly private high school tuition I paid without hesitation when his parents claimed they could not afford it. This was the same grandson who sat on my lap just a few years ago, listening to stories about his grandfather, promising, "When you get old, Grandma, I'm going to take care of you." Orch. I reached into my apron pocket and felt the tiny digital voice recorder I always kept with me. It was a habit I picked up after Harold passed away. Recording conversations with lawyers, doctors, or anyone else, just in case someone later claimed I had misunderstood important details. As a widow with substantial assets, life had taught me to protect myself with evidence. Orch. My finger found the record button and pressed it silently. "Axel, sweetheart, that is a deeply hurtful thing to say. You can't possibly mean that." He finally looked up, and I saw something in his expression that chilled me to the bone. Impatience. It was as if I were a slow waitress who was taking too long to bring out his order. "Look, Grandma, let's be real. Orch. You're 66, and your health hasn't been great lately. Mom says you'll probably need to move into a nursing home soon, and that's just going to drain all the cash. If you could just, slip away peacefully, wouldn't that be better for everyone? That way me, Mom, and Dad can actually use the money for things that matter. Next week is my 18th birthday, and I want to get a Tesla. Orch, do you have any idea how much that costs? Of course I knew how much it cost. $60,000. I knew because Axel had been dropping hints about it for months, and I had actually been considering buying it for him as an 18th birthday present. The irony made my stomach turn. Things that matter, I repeated, my voice hollow. Orch. So I suppose keeping your grandmother alive doesn't matter much at all. He shrugged so nonchalantly, yet it felt like a sharp slap across my face. You've already lived your life. Mine is just starting. Besides, what are you even doing with all that money? You just sit around in this huge house all day. At least if we had it, we could actually enjoy it. The pancakes were burning. Orch, I could smell the sharp, acrid smoke, but I could not move. I just stood there, watching my grandson, the young man I had loved unconditionally, reduce my entire existence to nothing more than an inconvenient roadblock keeping him from a sports car. Is that how your parents feel too? I asked quietly. Are you kidding? Dad's been researching care facilities for months. Orch. He found a budget option in Florida for $3,000 a month. Mom says once you're in there, you'll probably forget all about us pretty quickly anyway. So really, it's a win-win. $3,000 a month. Right now, I was giving that family $8,000 every single month to cover their mortgage, car payments, credit card bills, and Axel's allowance. Orch. That $8,000 came from the substantial life insurance payout. Harold had left me. Money intended to secure my comfort in my golden years. Suddenly, my mind drifted back to Harold. I remembered him sitting right where Axel was sitting now, drinking coffee and reading the morning paper to me. Orch. Harold used to bring me wildflowers from the garden, telling me I was just as beautiful as the day he married me. He never could have imagined that the grandson bearing his name would one day sit in his chair, actively wishing for his wife's death. Grandma, the pancakes are burning. Axel's voice snapped me back to reality. Orch. I turned off the burner and looked down at the blackened cakes, realizing they were a perfect metaphor for our relationship. Something that started out sweet and full of hope, utterly ruined by carelessness and cruelty. I scraped the charred food into the garbage disposal. The grinding roar of the machine drowned out the sound of the tears that began to fall. Orch. When I turned back around, Axel was already gone. His empty cereal bowl was left on the counter, and I heard his car start up in the driveway. He had gotten what he wanted. A free breakfast and a chance to tell his grandmother she should step aside for his convenience. Then he simply went on with his day, completely unbothered. Orch. I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life I had believed was filled with love. I had purchased these expensive appliances, hoping to create warm family memories. We had shared thousands of meals around that table. The refrigerator was covered in photographs, birthdays, graduations, Thanksgiving, Christmas. Orch. Every single moment I had documented, believing it proved how tight our family bond was. But looking at those photos now, I saw something completely different. In every single picture, I was the one reaching out. I was the one smiling the hardest, holding the tightest, and giving the most. And the others were just going through the motions. Orch. I walked into my bedroom and sat heavily on the edge of the bed I had shared with Harold for 44 years. Even after 5 years, a faint trace of his cologne lingered on his pillow. I buried my face in it and sobbed out loud for the first time since his funeral. When the tears finally stopped, I opened my nightstand drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. Orch. It was a place I had used to record daily notes after Harold died. Not just financial details, but unsettling observations about my family. Patterns I had noticed over time, but chosen to ignore. Cruel remarks I had brushed off as just jokes or misunderstandings. Now, skimming through my own handwriting, the truth hit me with absolute clarity. This was not a family porch. This was a business transaction, and I was nothing more than a cash cow they were all waiting to harvest. I picked up a pen and wrote down today's entry. Axel told me the best birthday gift I could give him is my death, so they can split my money. He is only 17, and he already views me as an ATM with an expiration date. As I wrote, something shifted inside me. Porch. The grief was still there, raw and painful, but alongside it emerged something firmer and colder. If my family truly believed I had zero value beyond my money, then perhaps it was time to show them what their lives would look like without that money flowing in. I closed the journal, walked over to the window, and looked out at the garden Harold and I had planted together. Porch. The roses were in full bloom, their vivid petals standing out against the green leaves. Harold used to say that roses were proof that beautiful things could still have thorns. Sometimes the most brilliant flowers were the ones that would draw blood if you were not careful with them. Porch. Standing there, watching those roses sway in the afternoon breeze, I realized it was time for this particular rose to show her thorns. After all, if they were so eager for me to be gone, maybe they deserved a taste of what that loss actually meant. Not the inheritance they were counting on, but the massive void left behind when the person who gave them everything finally stopped giving. Porch. The digital voice recorder was still in my pocket, its tiny red light blinking silently. It was irrefutable proof of my grandson's true feelings. It was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle I was only beginning to assemble, and this was only the beginning. Porch. How I used this realization would determine whether I spent the rest of my life as a victim of their greed, or as someone who finally learned to protect herself from the very people who were supposed to love her most. 3 days after Axel made those chilling remarks, I made a discovery that changed everything. What I uncovered that Thursday evening was not just more evidence of my family's greed. Porch. It was undeniable proof of a cold, calculated plot unfolding right under my nose. That evening, I drove over to my daughter Livia and my son-in-law Quentin's house to drop off some documents they needed for their mortgage refinancing. I was handling the paperwork for them because they claimed they could not afford the steep legal fees. Porch. It was sickening to reflect on now. While I was running errands to save them a few dollars on legal expenses, they were actively plotting how to push me out of the picture so they could claim the vast fortune they assumed I possessed. Their home was a spacious 2-story colonial. 8 years ago, I had handed them $40,000 for the down payment. Porch. To this day, their mortgage payments, home insurance, and most of their monthly utility bills were auto-debited directly from my checking account. Standing on their front porch with a thick stack of financial documents in my hands, I realized I was holding direct proof of how unconditionally I had supported this family. I rang the doorbell, but no one came to the door. Porch. Livia's car was parked in the driveway, and I could see the living room lights were on, so I knew they were inside. I knocked a few times before deciding to use the spare key they had given me years ago for emergencies. After all, I was practically paying for the place. As I stepped into the foyer, I caught the faint sound of voices coming from the kitchen. Porch. They were familiar voices, but the tone was unlike anything I had heard from them before. Low, hurried, and dripping with conspiracy. It was my daughter, Livia, my son-in-law, Quentin, and without a doubt, my grandson, Axel. I should have called out to let them know I was there. Instead, a sudden instinct made me freeze in place, holding my breath to listen. Porch. Looking back, I realized that after years of deliberate blind trust, my self-preservation instincts had finally woken up. The point is, we have to be smart about this, Quentin was saying, his voice carrying that cold, calculating tone he usually reserved for negotiating business contracts. We can't just sit around waiting for her to pass away naturally. Porch. She could easily live another 20 years, and by then, the money will be completely gone. Especially if she ends up needing long-term care. Livia chimed in. Do you have any idea how much those high-end care facilities cost? It could wipe out everything. My heart missed a beat. They were talking about me as if I were a stock they needed to sell off before its value plummeted. Ouch. So what are you suggesting? Axel asked, the eagerness obvious in his 17-year-old voice. This was the same voice that used to call me the best grandma in the world. I'm saying we need to encourage her to make some changes, Quentin continued. Get her to move into an assisted living facility sooner rather than later. Ouch. Once she's settled in, we can file for a conservatorship and power of attorney. All we have to do is demonstrate to a court that she's no longer mentally capable of managing her own finances. I pressed myself flat against the hallway wall, clapping a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping out loud. They were not just waiting for me to pass away. Ouch. They were actively planning to have me declared mentally incompetent while I was still alive, so they could legally seize control of my money. How are we going to manage that? Livia asked. She's sharp. Everyone knows her mind is totally fine. Not everyone, Quentin replied, and I could actually hear the smirk in his voice. Ouch. I've been keeping track of little incidents, times when she misplaces something or gets confused about a date. I'm building a paper trail. What kind of paper trail? Axel wanted to know. Mostly medical records. I noticed Dr. Peterson retired last year, so your mom is seeing a new doctor now. Someone who doesn't know her personal history. Ouch. I've been going to her appointments with her, steering the conversations, hinting to the doctor that we have concerns about her memory and decision-making. My blood ran cold. Quentin had been quietly sabotaging my medical records, planting seeds of doubt about my cognitive abilities with a doctor who barely knew me. That's brilliant, Livia gasped. Ouch. How long until we can officially take over? A few months, give or take. The key is to make it look like a gradual decline. We can't rush it, or it'll raise red flags. What about the money? Axel pressed. How much are we actually looking at? I held my breath, waiting to hear their estimate of my net worth. What came out of Quentin's mouth next nearly knocked me off my feet. Ouch. Well, first there's the house, obviously. That's worth at least $500,000 right now, Quentin said. Then there are the investment accounts, the savings, plus the payout from Harold's life insurance. Last time I looked into it, the total was pushing $3 million. $3 million. They thought I was worth $3 million. Ouch. The reality was, I only had about $800,000 left. The rest of the money, Harold's insurance payout, our lifetime of retirement savings, everything we had built across 44 years of marriage, had been spent supporting this family. Ouch. Axel's private school tuition, Livia and Quentin's mortgage, car loans, lavish vacations, emergency bailouts, medical bills, and an endless stream of material demands that continuously drained my resources. I had never told them the exact numbers of what I was spending. I never wanted them to feel guilty for accepting my help. Ouch. Because of that, they assumed I was sitting on a mountain of wealth that simply no longer existed. $3 million. Axel let out a low whistle. That's more than enough for my Tesla, my college tuition, and pretty much anything else I want. Don't forget we have expenses too, Livia reminded him. Your dad and I have been carrying this family on our backs. Ouch. This house, the 2 cars, our credit card debt, we need that money just as much as you do. There's plenty to go around, Quentin said smoothly. Right now, the priority is making sure we get control before she does something foolish and spends it all. Like what? Livia asked. Like donating it to charity, or deciding to travel the world, or even worse, getting remarried. Ouch. You know how lonely older women can be. They're easy targets for smooth-talking men looking to take advantage of them. The hypocrisy was sickening. They were worried about someone else taking advantage of me while they were actively orchestrating a sinister plot to strip me of everything I owned. So, what's our timeline? Axel pushed. Ouch. I think right after your birthday next week, we start ramping up the pressure, Quentin said. We start dropping hints that living alone isn't safe for someone her age. We can bring up a few of those moments where she seemed confused or forgetful. Get her comfortable with the idea that she needs more help than she wants to admit. And then, Livia prompted, Porch. Then we help her pick out a nice facility, somewhere comfortable, but definitely not overly expensive. That place in Florida we looked at would work. We want to preserve as much of the estate as possible. What if she refuses to go? Axel asked. If she's declared legally incompetent, she won't have a choice, Quentin explained patiently, like a professor giving a lecture. Porch. Once we have power of attorney and conservatorship, every decision falls to us, where she lives, how her money is spent. It's entirely our call. I had heard enough. It was far beyond what I could handle. I backed away toward the front door as silently as I could, my heart pounding so hard I was convinced they would hear it in the kitchen. Porch. My hands shook uncontrollably as I slipped the key back into the lock and eased myself outside. Sitting in my car in their driveway, staring at the house I had helped them purchase, I processed everything I had just overheard. This was not a family discussing legitimate concerns about an aging relative. This was a cold, calculated operation. Porch. They planned to deceive me, strip away my independence, toss me into a cheap facility, and comfortably live off the money I had worked for 44 years to earn. The terrifying part was not even the money. It was the detached, businesslike manner in which they discussed dismantling my life. There was no affection in their voices, no guilt, no second thoughts. Porch. They talked about taking away my legal rights as casually as if they were discussing refinancing a loan or choosing a vacation spot. I remembered Axel's comment from 3 days ago about his best birthday gift. Now I understood that my natural death was actually inconvenient for them. Porch. They needed me alive, but stripped of all legal authority. A helpless source of funds they could drain until every last dollar was gone. Driving through the familiar suburban streets I had called home for 23 years, I felt a fundamental shift deep inside myself. Porch. The heartbreak and shock from Axel's words were still there, but now they were eclipsed by something far sharper and far more dangerous. Clarity. For the first time in years, I saw my family for who they truly were. Not through a lens of love, hope, and deliberate blind trust, but with a razor-sharp focus that stopped making excuses for the inexcusable. Porch. They viewed me as a naive, foolish old woman who was easily manipulated. They assumed I was so desperate for their affection that I would never question their motives, let alone take steps to protect myself. They thought I was weak, helpless, and stupid. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Porch. When I got home, I went straight to my bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept my confidential documents. Tucked safely behind my birth certificate and social security card was something I had hoped I would never need to use. It was a secondary trust document. 5 years ago, right after Harold passed away, I had it drafted and notarized. Porch. At the time, I was feeling vulnerable living alone and wanted to ensure my affairs were completely bulletproof. That document looked nothing like the official family trust my relatives knew about. The primary trust on file with my lawyer left everything to Livia, to eventually pass down to Axel. Porch. But this backup document, an insurance policy created out of a widow's caution, named a completely different set of beneficiaries. My hand trembled slightly as I pulled out the sealed envelope. The papers inside had the power to rewrite everything. It represented a choice I had desperately hoped I would never have to make. Porch. But after overhearing their conversation tonight, I knew it was no longer a choice. It was a matter of survival. I opened my journal and wrote, "They think I have $3 million. They have no idea I've already spent most of it on them. They are planning to have me declared incompetent so they can take what's left. They think I am weak, confused, and easily pushed around." Porch. I paused, my pen hovering over the page, before adding, "They are dead wrong, and they are about to find out exactly what that mistake costs." Tomorrow was Friday. Next week, Axel turned 18, expecting his $50,000 payout. The week after that, they planned to launch their strategy to declare me unfit and put me away. Except now, I had a strategy of my own. A plan they could never anticipate, and by the time they realized what was happening, it would be far too late for any of them. If they wanted to treat me like a foolish old woman who did not know any better, perhaps it was time to show them just how awake this foolish old woman really was. The morning after discovering my family's scheme, I woke up feeling an unusual sense of calm. For the first time in years, I was no longer wondering if I was being overly sensitive or misinterpreting their behavior. I had heard the truth with my own ears, captured it on tape, and knew exactly where I stood. I was no longer their beloved grandmother and mother. I was their target. What they did not realize was that their target had been observing them far longer than they had been plotting against her. While they thought they were being clever with their little maneuvers, I had been recording their actions in my journal for months. Every passive-aggressive comment passed off as a joke, every financial demand framed as a temporary setback, every subtle attempt at control disguised as worrying about my health. I had simply been too afraid to accept where all the evidence led. Now, I was ready to run a little test of my own. I started with Livia. My daughter called on Friday morning, right on schedule. On the surface, she was checking in on my health, but in reality, she was monitoring my finances. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" Her voice had that phony, overly sweet tone she always used when she was angling for financial help. "Actually, I've been a little stressed about something," I said, leaning back in Harold's old recliner with my morning coffee. I had a meeting with my financial advisor yesterday, and he brought up a few concerning details. Of course, there had been no meeting, but I needed to see how fast this fake crisis would circulate through the family network. "What details?" Livia's tone instantly sharpened, suddenly full of interest. "Well, you know how I've been helping you and Quentin with the mortgage and other expenses?" I paused, letting the tension build. It turns out I might have been a bit more generous than I actually could afford to be. "What do you mean?" Now she sounded genuinely anxious. "My advisor said that at my current rate of spending, I need to start scaling back significantly. He's concerned about my long-term financial stability." The line went completely dead for several seconds. When Livia finally spoke, her voice was tightly controlled. "How much scaling back are we talking about? Not, are you okay? Not, is there anything we can do to help?" Just an immediate focus on how this affected her cash flow. He suggested I reduce the monthly $8,000 support I send you down to maybe $2,000, at least until I get a better handle on things. $2,000? Livia's voice pitched up an octave. "Mom, that won't even cover our mortgage. We count on that money." "I know, sweetheart, and I'm so sorry, but I have to make sure my own future is secure." "What if I need long-term care later on?" "Those high-end facilities are incredibly expensive." "You don't need to worry about that," Livia said rapidly. "If anything happens, we'll take care of you. You don't need to hoard your money just for some care facility." Hoarding my money? As if keeping enough funds to take care of myself in my later years was somehow a moral failing. "I hope so, dear. But my advisor insists I need to be careful. In fact, he suggested I consider selling this large house, maybe downsize to a smaller, more manageable condo." "Sell the house?" Livia sounded utterly horrified. "Mom, you can't do that. That house has so much sentimental value. Dad built that garden for you. All your memories are there." How fascinating that sentimental value suddenly mattered so much, purely because selling this house might shrink her eventual inheritance. "I know it's tough," I said wistfully. "But if I sell it, I could invest the proceeds for a steady income stream. Maybe I could even step up the financial support for you and Axel again." I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, calculating whether a lump sum from a house sale was a better deal than monthly payments. "Let me talk to Quentin about this," she said finally. "Maybe we can come up with some alternatives. You shouldn't be making big decisions like this all by yourself." You're so thoughtful, dear. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Orch. Family should stick together, shouldn't we? After hanging up, I opened the stopwatch app on my phone. I wanted to see how long it would take for this fictional financial crisis to bounce around the family and make its way back to me. The answer. Exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes. Quentin called first. Orch. His tone was smooth and full of concern, using the polished professional voice he reserved for difficult clients. Dolores. Livia mentioned you've had some financial worries lately. If you don't mind, I'd be more than happy to take a look at your portfolio. Sometimes these financial advisors like to scare older clients into making unnecessary changes. That's very kind of you, Quentin. Orch. But I'm not sure I'm ready to share those details just yet. It feels very personal. Of course. But if you're worried about long-term care costs, we could explore a few strategies. Ways to protect your assets while still making sure you get the care you need. Orch. Protect my assets? He meant sheltering the assets in a trust so I could qualify for government assistance, all while safeguarding the inheritance they planned to collect. What kind of strategies? I played naive. Well, sometimes it makes sense to transfer assets to family members early. That way, those funds aren't factored in when determining eligibility for certain assistance programs. Orch. It's completely above board and it guarantees the money stays where it belongs. Within the family, where it belongs, as if the money I worked for and saved my whole life naturally belonged to them instead of me. That sounds complicated, I said. Wouldn't that mean giving up control over my own money? Not necessarily. Orch. We could set up an irrevocable trust that ensures your living expenses are covered while protecting the remaining assets. I know some top-tier attorneys who specialize in elder care planning. I bet you do. Attorneys who could help you legally take control of my property. Let me think about it, I said. It all feels a bit overwhelming. Naturally. Orch. But Dolores, please don't make any major decisions without talking to us first. We care about you, and we want to make sure nobody takes advantage of you during a vulnerable moment. The sheer audacity of his hypocrisy was almost sickening. 2 hours later, Axel called. Orch. My 17-year-old grandson, who just a week ago was wishing for my death, suddenly showed a deep interest in my financial situation. Grandma, Mom said you're having a financial crisis. Is everything okay? I wouldn't call it a crisis, sweetie. I just need to be a little more careful with my spending. So does that mean you can't give me the $50,000 for my birthday? Orch. There it was. No build-up, not a shred of genuine concern for my situation. Just straight to the point. How did this affect his expected payday? I don't know yet, dear. $50,000 is a substantial amount of money. Maybe we could look at a slightly less expensive gift that you'd still enjoy. Silence stretched across the line. So long I thought the call had dropped. Orch. But you promised, he finally blurted out, his tone dripping with frustration. I was counting on that money. I already picked out the Tesla I want. I know, and I'm sorry, but circumstances change. Maybe instead of a luxury car, we could consider something more practical. A nice laptop for college or some new clothes? A laptop? His voice spiked with anger. Orch. Grandma, everyone my age has a laptop. I don't need another computer. I need a car. Need? I repeated. Axel, you already have a car, the Honda Civic I bought you last year. That piece of junk? It's embarrassing to drive. All my friends drive nice cars. I can't pull up to college in a beat-up Honda. Orch. The Honda Civic that cost me $22,000 was now a piece of junk to him, simply because it failed to boost his ego. Sweetheart, some kids your age would be incredibly grateful to have any car at all. Yeah, well, I'm not some kids. I'm your grandson. You should want the absolute best for me. The sense of entitlement was suffocating. Orch. In his mind, my love for him was measured entirely by how much money I showered on him. If I did not buy him a Tesla, it meant I did not care about his happiness. I do want the best for you, I said softly. I just think we have very different ideas of what the best actually means. Whatever, he muttered. I guess I'll just have to figure something else out. Porch. After he hung up, I sat in Harold's chair for a long time, reviewing all three conversations. My manufactured financial crisis had laid bare the complete truth about my family's motives. Not a single one of them had shown genuine concern for my well-being. Not one had offered to help me navigate my supposed difficulties. Porch. Their sole concern was how my imaginary financial troubles would impact their access to my actual bank account. Most telling of all was how quickly they all arrived at the exact same conclusion. I needed to hand over control of my assets to them for my own protection. They were not even trying to hide it anymore. That evening, I placed a call to Martin Henderson, my actual financial advisor. Porch. Martin had managed Harold's and my investment portfolio for the past 12 years, and he was one of the very few people who understood the true state of my finances. Dolores, he said warmly when his secretary transferred the line over. How are you? I haven't heard from you since our quarterly review last month. I'm fine, Martin, but I do have a question for you. Porch. If I wanted to make some major changes to my estate plan, what does that process look like? What kind of changes are you considering? Hypothetically, I want to remove my current beneficiaries and designate entirely new ones. How fast could something like that be finalized? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Porch. Martin knew my family situation and was well aware that I had been supporting Livia and Quentin heavily over the years. Is everything all right, Dolores? Everything has become very clear, I said. It's not quite the same as all right, but it's an improvement. If I am completely certain, can a change like this be handled quickly? Yes, if your mind is made up, it can move very quickly. Porch. I thought about Axel's cruel words, wishing for my death. I thought about the conspiratorial meeting I had overheard in their kitchen. I thought about the 3 phone calls from earlier that day that confirmed my absolute worst fears about their motives. I am very certain, I said. When can we meet? How about Monday morning at 10? Perfect. And Martin, please prepare a few different options. Porch. I might be making some rather drastic changes. After hanging up, I walked through my house, taking it in with entirely fresh eyes. This house that Livia was so terrified I might sell. This house where Harold and I built our life together, raised our daughter, and dreamed of growing old surrounded by people who loved us. It was still a beautiful home, filled with wonderful memories. Porch. But it was also a shrine to a past that no longer existed. Harold was gone, and the warm, loving family I thought we had built was nothing more than an illusion maintained by my monthly financial infusions. Maybe it was time to stop living in the shadows of the past and start building something real for whatever time I had left. In my bedroom, I opened my journal and wrote, Today I tested them. Porch. They failed miserably. They do not view me as a person with independent needs, fears, and rights. They view me as a resource to be managed, controlled, and eventually drained dry. The test is over. Now it's time to release the results. Outside my window, the garden Harold and I planted together was in full bloom. Porch. Roses, daisies, hollyhocks. We had chosen those flowers because they bloomed year after year, creating lasting beauty. But even the most beautiful garden requires pruning. Sometimes, pruning means cutting away the weeds that are choking out all the actual life. Tomorrow was Saturday. Axel's birthday party was next Friday. Before then, I needed to have all my pieces on the board. Porch. Because if my family wanted to treat me like a naive, foolish old woman they could push around, I was going to show them just how far this foolish old woman was willing to go. By Monday morning, I had finalized every necessary appointment. My financial advisor, Martin Henderson, my estate attorney, Robert Chen, and Dr. Porch. Patricia Williams, a specialist in geriatric psychiatry recommended by Martin. By the end of the day, each of them held a backup audio file from my digital recorder, a copy of my journal entries documenting the last 6 months of my family's behavior, and a detailed timeline report. I was no longer just protecting myself. I was building an airtight ironclad case. Porch. The updates to my trust and will were notarized on Tuesday. The transfer of assets was officially initiated on Wednesday. By Thursday, exactly 1 week after I overheard that devastating conversation in my daughter's kitchen, the net was fully cast. Friday morning broke crisp and clear. It was Axel's 18th birthday. The day he expected to receive a $50,000 check was instead going to be the day he learned what happens when you wish for your grandmother to pass away. To mark his milestone birthday, I invited the whole family over for dinner. Livia was thrilled when she got the invitation, likely assuming it meant that despite my financial crisis, I was still feeling generous. Quentin volunteered to pick up a cake from a wildly expensive French bakery downtown. Axel was sulking, but he tagged along anyway, no doubt expecting his Tesla down payment to materialize right alongside dessert. At 6 o'clock sharp, they arrived on my doorstep, wearing weaponized smiles and fake affection. Livia brought a bouquet of grocery store daisies, probably costing $12 at most. Quentin carried the fancy bakery box, like it was his grand personal gift to the evening. Axel wore a brand new designer shirt, almost certainly paid for out of his monthly allowance from me. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, giving my grandson a hug. He went stiff in my arms, eager to breeze through the pleasantries and get straight to the part of the night where money changed hands. We made hollow small talk over dinner. I served beef stew, Axel's favorite, alongside mashed potatoes and green beans harvested straight from the garden Harold and I had planted. The conversation was dry and forced. Everyone was playing their assigned role in this domestic sitcom, but the underlying tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, while I was slicing the cake, Livia brought up the question that had been hovering over all of them all night. "So, Mom, how did your meeting with your financial advisor go this week? Are things looking any better?" "Actually," I said, placing a neat slice of chocolate cake on a plate, "things have gotten much clearer. I've made some very important decisions regarding my finances." Quentin instantly leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "What kind of decisions?" I set down the cake knife and looked around the table, taking in the 3 people who had spent the last week plotting to strip away my independence, my dignity, and my money. Well, I realized that Martin, my advisor, was absolutely right about one thing. I've been entirely too careless with my money. "We told you we could help you set up a better plan," Livia chimed in eagerly. "You don't have to handle this all by yourself." "You are all so generous," I said, my voice as calm as still water. "But I've already taken care of it. I made significant changes to protect my assets and secure my long-term safety." Axel finally looked up from his plate, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "What changes?" "To start, I have transferred the vast majority of my liquid assets into an irrevocable trust. Those funds can now only be accessed for my personal medical care and daily living expenses. It is legally protected at the highest level." The silence that fell over the dining room was deafening. I continued serving the cake as naturally as if I were commenting on the weather. "I have also arranged for my future care. If a day comes where I am genuinely unable to manage my own affairs, a professional fiduciary guardian will step in. I'll never have to worry about being taken advantage of by people who might not have my best interests at heart." Quentin's fork clattered onto his plate with a sharp clink. "Dolores, that seems a bit extreme." "Family is supposed to take care of family." "I completely agree," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Family is supposed to take care of family. They are supposed to protect one another. They are absolutely, under no circumstances, supposed to plot to steal from each other." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Livia's face went entirely white. "Mom, what on earth are you talking about?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my digital voice recorder. I set it right next to the birthday cake, its silver casing reflecting the cold light of the chandelier overhead. "I'm talking about the conversation you had last Thursday evening. The one where you discussed filing to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could legally take my money." The one where you plan to put me in some cheap facility and live off my life savings. Axel's jaw dropped. Quentin opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. Please let me finish. I listened to your entire scheme with a great deal of patience. George. Now it's your turn to listen. I pressed play on the recorder. Quentin's voice filled the room, crisp, clear, and damning. I'm saying we need to encourage her to make some changes. Get her to move into an assisted living facility. Once she's settled in, we can file for a conservatorship and power of attorney, claim she's no longer mentally capable. George. I let the recording play for 30 seconds before pressing stop. The silence that followed was suffocating. 27 minutes, I said casually. That's how long you spent discussing the best way to destroy my life. Very thorough, very detailed, and very clearly recorded. Livia stared at the digital recorder as if it were a venomous snake. George. Mom, you don't understand. We were just worried about you. Worried about me? I laughed, a sharp sound that made them all flinch. Let me play another clip for you. I fast-forwarded to Axel's voice. 3 million. That's more than enough for my Tesla, my college tuition, and pretty much anything else I want. Axel's face drained of color. Grandma, I didn't mean it like that. George. Oh, you meant it, I cut him off. Just like you meant it when you told me that the best birthday gift I could give you was to pass away so you could split my money. Yes, I recorded that conversation too. I reached into my other pocket, pulled out a manila envelope, and laid it beside the recorder. George. Inside here are copies of all my audio recordings, transcriptions of my journal entries tracking your behavior over the past year, and signed statements from 3 different medical specialists confirming that I am of sound mind. It also includes copies of the new legal documents I signed this week. Quentin was the first to find his voice, though it came out as a raspy whisper. George. What legal documents? First, a new will. The old one left everything to Livia and Axel. This new one names entirely different beneficiaries. Who? Livia's voice was barely audible. The American Cancer Society, the local food bank, and the Children's Hospital where I used to volunteer. Organizations that actually help people rather than exploit them. George. Axel slammed his hands on the table and stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. You can't do that. That money is supposed to be ours. Actually, I said, remaining seated with my hands folded, that money is mine. I earned it, I saved it, and I can leave it to whomever I choose. But we are your family. Livia's voice cracked in desperation. Are you? I asked softly. George. Because real family doesn't conspire to steal from one another. Real family doesn't wish for each other to die. Real family doesn't plan to declare an aging relative incompetent just to lock her away. We were never actually going to do that, Quentin argued defensively. We were just exploring options. George. For 27 minutes, in painstaking detail, right down to the timeline and execution, I said, picking up the recorder. Would you like me to play the part where you discussed which care facility was the cheapest? This is insane, Axel yelled. You're punishing us over a private conversation? George. A private conversation about how to strip away my freedom and take my money. I replied coldly. Yes, I suppose I am. I slowly stood up, feeling an odd sense of tranquility despite the chaos around me. There's one more thing, I said. I've already arranged it. All monthly financial assistance to your household is terminated effective immediately. George, the $8,000 monthly transfers end today. Livia gasped. Mom, we can't afford. You'll figure it out, I said. After all, you're capable adults. You survived before I started funding your lives, and you'll survive now. You are destroying this family, Quentin accused, his professional composure shattering completely. No, I said firmly. George. You destroyed this family the moment you decided to view me as nothing more than an ATM. You destroyed this family when you taught your son that his grandmother's death was the ultimate birthday present. You destroyed this family when you plotted to take away my dignity. George. I walked over to the window and looked out at Harold's garden, where the roses were still blooming stubbornly against the late autumn chill. I loved you, I said softly, without turning around. All of you. I would have given you anything you needed, supported you through any crisis, and stood by you no matter what. All I wanted in return was basic respect and common decency. Mom, please. Livia was crying now. We can fix this, we can start over. I turned to face them, feeling something settle deep within my chest, something that felt an awful lot like peace. No, I said, we can't, because this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is who you are and who you've been all along. I've simply stopped making excuses for you. Axel glared at me with pure venom. So that's it? You're just cutting us off completely? You cut yourselves off, I answered. The moment you decided my death was worth more to you than my life. I walked to the front door and pulled it wide open. The cool night air swept into the house. I think it's time for you to leave now. Take your cake with you. I have no use for it. They filed out in stunned silence. Quentin carried the expensive bakery box like a useless prop in a failed play. Livia paused at the threshold, tears streaming down her face. Mom, family isn't supposed to work like this. You're right, I said quietly. Family is supposed to love and protect one another. They're supposed to cherish the time they have together. They're supposed to see each other as treasures, not obstacles to clear away. I moved to close the door, then paused. Happy birthday, Axel. I called out to my grandson, who was standing by his father's car, fists clenched at his sides. I hope you got everything you deserve tonight. As their car pulled out of my driveway, I shut the door, leaned against it, and felt a sudden wave of sheer exhaustion wash over me. It was over. After 66 years of believing that family was everything, I had finally learned to put myself first. The house felt different now, quiet, but not empty, clean, like a fresh start. I walked back into the dining room, looking at the table still set for 4, the half-eaten slices of cake, and the digital recorder sitting quietly beside the $12 grocery store daisies. The bouquet that represented the full measure of their appreciation. Tomorrow, I would begin planning a life without them in it. Tonight, I was going to sit in Harold's chair and remember what it felt like to be loved by someone who truly cherished me, rather than someone who saw me as an expiration date on a bank account. But first, I had one more call to make. I picked up my phone and dialed Martin Henderson's number. Martin, it's Dolores. Yes, I know it's late. I just wanted to let you know the family dinner went exactly as expected. You can move forward with the final asset transfers we discussed. After ending the call, I felt lighter than I had in years. The heavy burden of their expectations, demands, and endless emotional manipulation was finally off my shoulders. I was free. And that was the best gift anyone could have given me. Unconditional peace. A peace that started right here with me. That quiet lasted for exactly 48 hours. Saturday and Sunday passed in absolute bliss. No phone calls, no unannounced visits, no manipulative text messages. For the first time in years, I woke up in the morning without feeling weighed down by their overwhelming demands. I brewed myself a fresh pot of coffee, read the morning paper uninterrupted, and spent time weeding Harold's garden without having to listen to anyone make passive-aggressive comments about whether someone my age should be doing manual labor. It was the most peaceful weekend I had experienced since Harold passed away. Monday morning, however, brought the storm I knew was coming. The first phone call came in at 7:15 a.m. while I was watering the roses. Livia's number flashed on my screen and I let it go straight to voicemail. 5 minutes later, a second call came in, followed immediately by a third. By 8 o'clock, she had called 12 times. I finally answered on the 13th ring. Mom, thank God! Her voice sounded panicked and desperate. We need to talk. This whole thing is a huge misunderstanding. Which part is a misunderstanding? I asked, sitting back in Harold's chair with my coffee. The part where you planned to have me declared mentally incompetent, or the part where you wanted to take my money? We weren't trying to steal anything, she cried, her voice cracking. We were trying to protect you. Protect me from what? Torch. Protect me from having control over my own life. Mom, you don't realize how vulnerable you are. There are so many scammers out there targeting older women. We just wanted to make sure you didn't end up being taken advantage of. The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud. You mean taken advantage of by people like you? That is so unfair. We are your family. Torch. Everything we did was out of love. Love, I repeated. Is love when your 17-year-old son tells his grandmother that her death would be the ultimate birthday present? Axel is just a kid. He didn't know what he was saying. He knew exactly what he was saying. Torch. He knew enough to calculate how much money he stood to inherit, and he knew enough to pick out the Tesla he planned to buy with my death payout. Silence fell between us, heavy with the ugly truths neither of us could take back. Mom, please, Livia sobbed. Don't destroy our family over this. I am not destroying anything, I said calmly. Torch. I'm just finally seeing what was already destroyed a long time ago. After hanging up, I poured a second cup of coffee and sat down to review my voicemails. There were 17 messages in total, pleadings from Livia, Quentin trying to sound reasonable and professional, and Axel remaining surprisingly silent. Torch. It was the 18th message that caught my attention, coming from a number I didn't recognize. Hello, Ms. Dolores Patterson. This is Amanda Morrison from Adult Protective Services. We have received a report expressing serious concerns regarding your well-being, and we would like to conduct a welfare check at your earliest convenience. My blood ran cold. They hadn't wasted a single second. Torch. I immediately called Martin Henderson. Dolores, he answered on the first ring. I was waiting for your call. You received some interesting outreach this morning, didn't you? How did you know? Because they called me first. Your son-in-law wanted to know if there was any legal avenue to challenge the changes you made to your estate. He seemed very concerned about your mental state. Torch. And what did you tell him? I told him I've worked with you for 12 years, that your mind is sharper than ever, and that any attempt to challenge your cognitive abilities would be met with the full force of the documentation we prepared, including your recordings. I felt some of the tension drain from my shoulders. What about this Adult Protective Services check? Torch. Standard procedure when someone files a report expressing concern. Don't worry, Dr. Williams is expecting their call. She's fully prepared to handle any mental capacity evaluations they might request. Dr. Patricia Williams was the top geriatric psychiatrist Martin had recommended. Torch. Last Wednesday, we had spent 2 hours in her office, during which she put me through a rigorous mental status examination. She concluded that I was not only fully competent, but remarkably resilient for someone dealing with familial exploitation. How long will this go on? I asked. Until they realize they have zero legal standing and no chance of winning. Torch. Your documentation is airtight, Dolores. They can't prove you're incompetent because you're not, and they can't challenge your right to alter your trust because it's your money to do with as you see fit. After hanging up with Martin, I decided to take a drive to clear my head. I needed to get out of the house, away from the phone and the lingering memories of Friday night. Torch. Without consciously planning it, I found myself driving toward the cemetery where Harold was laid to rest. I hadn't visited since the anniversary of his passing 6 months ago. His headstone was a simple slab of granite engraved with his name, dates, and the epitaph we had chosen together. Beloved husband and father. Torch. I sat on the small bench beside his grave and spoke into the quiet afternoon air. You would be so disappointed in them, I said softly. Especially Axel, you had such high hopes for him. A gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees, shading Harold's resting place. I found myself thinking back to the man I married 50 years ago. Torch. He was 21 when we met, working long hours on construction sites just to pay for night school. He had calloused hands and big dreams, loving me fiercely without a shred of manipulation or control. You always said family was everything, I whispered to the headstone. But you meant real family. People who choose to care for each other, not just people who happen to share DNA. Orch. When I arrived back home, there were 3 cars parked in my driveway. Livia's Honda, Quentin's BMW, and a silver sedan I didn't recognize. Through the living room window, I could see people sitting on my front porch. I pulled into the garage and went in through the kitchen door, hoping to avoid a confrontation outside. Before I could even set my purse down, the doorbell rang, chiming repeatedly. Orch. I finally pulled the door open. Standing there was my family, accompanied by a well-dressed woman in her late 90s, holding a clipboard, wearing the polished, professional empathy of a trained caseworker. Miss Patterson, I'm Amanda Morrison from Adult Protective Services. I believe these are your family members. Unfortunately, yes, I said. We are here to conduct a welfare check. Orch. Your family has expressed severe concerns regarding your recent behavior and decision-making capacity. I looked past her at Livia, Quentin, and Axel huddled together like conspirators. Livia's eyes were red and swollen from crying, Quentin looked like he was trying to solve a complex business problem, and Axel just looked sullen and angry. What kind of concerns? I asked Amanda. Orch. They reported that you have recently made some highly erratic financial decisions, that you've become paranoid and suspicious of the family members trying to help you, and that you may be suffering from a form of dementia or age-related cognitive decline. I took a step back and opened the door wide. Please, come in, everyone. We sat down in the living room like 2 opposing armies. Orch. Amanda Morrison took a seat in the center with her clipboard, while my family sat together on the sofa across from me. I took my usual spot in Harold's chair, hands resting calmly in my lap. Miss Patterson, Amanda began, your family is worried that you recently made sweeping changes to your estate plan and financial arrangements. Can you walk me through what happened? Certainly. Orch. I discovered that my family was actively planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, so they could take my money and place me in a budget care facility. So, I took steps to protect myself. Amanda's pen paused over her clipboard. That is a very serious allegation. It is. Would you like to hear the recordings? I reached into my bag, but Quentin cut in defensively. See. Orch. That's exactly what we're talking about. Quentin gestured toward me. She's obsessed with these so-called recordings. She genuinely believes we're all plotting against her. I don't believe you were plotting against me, I said quietly. I know you were plotting against me, because I heard it with my own ears. I pulled out the digital recorder and set it on the coffee table. Ms. Orch. Morrison, would you like to hear what my family really thinks when they assume I'm not listening? Amanda looked uncomfortable. Miss Patterson, I'm not sure if this is. Please listen, I interrupted firm. I insist. After all, they called you here out of concern for my mental state. I think it's essential that you hear what was actually being discussed. I pressed play. Orch. Quentin's voice echoed through my living room. Once she's settled in, we can file for a conservatorship and power of attorney, claim she's no longer mentally capable. Amanda's eyes widened instantly. I fast-forwarded to the next clip. The key is to make it look like a gradual decline. We can't rush it, or it'll raise red flags. Orch. The room fell dead silent as I played the segment where Axel discussed how much money he stood to inherit after my death, the cold reality of their plan filling the space between us. Amanda Morrison looked from the recorder to my family, and finally back to me. Miss Patterson, how long have you been aware of these discussions? I've been documenting their behavior for months, I said. Orch. But I overheard this specific conversation last Thursday evening, the night before I updated my trust. And you made those updates as a direct result of this conversation? I made those updates to protect myself from a clear threat. Wouldn't you do the same? Amanda turned to Livia. Ma'am, is this recording accurate? Livia's face flushed bright red with shame and anger. Orch. That was completely taken out of context. We were just discussing possibilities if Mom needed long-term care. Every family has conversations like that. Is that so? Amanda asked sternly. Do most families discuss how to have an elderly relative declared mentally incompetent so they can place her in the cheapest facility available? Orch. We were never actually going to go through with it, Quentin interjected quickly. We were just exploring options. For 27 minutes, I added, with a specific timeline and strategy. Amanda jotted down several notes on her clipboard before turning back to me. Miss Patterson, can you tell me what specific financial changes you made? Orch. I transferred the majority of my assets into a protected trust that can only be used for my personal care. I appointed a professional fiduciary service in the event that I am ever truly unable to handle my affairs, and I modified my will to leave my estate to charitable organizations rather than individuals who view me as a roadblock to an inheritance. Orch. Did you make these decisions voluntarily, without any external pressure or influence? Entirely voluntarily. In fact, I made them specifically to shield myself from external pressure and influence. Amanda spent another 20 minutes asking me questions about my daily routines, medication management, and social connections. Orch. I answered each question clearly and thoroughly, occasionally referencing my journal whenever specific dates or details were needed. Finally, she closed her clipboard and stood up. Ms. Patterson, based on this interview, I see no evidence of cognitive decline, dementia, or impaired decision-making capacity. Orch. You appear to be a fully competent adult who made a series of rational choices to protect herself from potential financial exploitation. Livia stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. You're just taking her word for all of this? I am taking the evidence into account, Amanda said firmly, including an audio recording of your family discussing how to defraud an elderly relative. Miss Orch. Patterson, would you like me to file a report with law enforcement regarding these threats? I looked at the three people who had once been the center of my world. They looked terrified now, desperate like animals backed into a corner. No, I said finally. I don't want to press charges. I just want them to leave me alone. Amanda nodded. I will note that in my report, Orch. But I must advise you that if this behavior continues, or if there are any further attempts at intimidation, you should contact law enforcement immediately. After Amanda left, I stood facing my family in the living room, a room that had once been filled with birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and quiet Sunday dinners. Are you happy now? Axel spat angrily. You turned everyone against us. Orch. I didn't turn anyone against you, I said. I just stopped pretending that the way you treated me was acceptable. This isn't over, Quentin said, his professional composure completely shattered. You can't just throw your family away like this. Watch me, I replied. They left without another word. Orch. I locked the door behind them, listened to their cars drive away, and leaned against the wood, feeling a deep, quiet sense of relief. I walked back into the living room, picked up my recorder, and set it on the shelf beside a framed photograph of Harold. I was 66 years old, single, and starting over completely. But for the first time in a very long time, I was surrounded only by truth. Orch. And that was more than enough to build a life on. Then, I walked over to Harold's chair, sat down, and finally allowed myself to cry. I instructed the driver to park a short distance down the street. I wanted to take in the view before shattering this illusion completely. Through the dense green hedge, I could see the absurdly lavish spectacle unfolding in the backyard. Orch. This was definitely no standard weekend cookout. Ashley had spared no expense for what she envisioned as her victory party. A massive white canvas tent stood over the stone patio, offering cool shade. Long tables were draped in immaculate white linen and decorated with towering floral centerpieces. Orch. Uniformed staff members navigated the manicured lawn with heavy silver trays of artisanal appetizers, keeping glasses filled with expensive vintage champagne. A live jazz quartet played near the large swimming pool, setting a steady, upbeat rhythm that gave the entire gathering an elevated atmosphere. Orch. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of people eager to climb into Atlanta's elite circles. Ashley's pretentious country club friends milled about in designer summer dresses. Brandon had invited a few local investors he still hoped to impress. Porch. Scattered among these strangers were my own relatives, the very family members who had spent the last few days enthusiastically spreading vicious lies about me. And right at the center of Num's manufactured paradise stood my younger brother. Brandon was holding court near the outdoor stone kitchen, completely in his element. Porch. He leaned casually against the granite countertop, wearing a sharp light blue linen suit, almost certainly purchased on credit. He held a heavy crystal glass filled with aged scotch, laughing loud and free as he swirled the amber liquid inside. He played the part of a tycoon who had just closed the deal of a lifetime. His chest was puffed out, his gestures exaggerated, exuding an untouchable confidence. Surrounded by a rapt audience of Ashley's elite friends, he was weaving a heavily sanitized, completely fictional story about how he had single-handedly masterminded a brilliant corporate transition. He bragged about orchestrating a complex deal to sell a lucrative commercial asset to an out-of-state investment firm. He spoke with total conviction, believing he had outsmarted the corporate banking system, crushed his overbearing older sister, and walked away with nearly $1 million. He took a satisfied to his scotch, completely unaware that the major federal crime he had committed was fully documented and currently sitting in a briefcase just outside his front gate. Only a few feet away, Ashley worked the crowd with the same frantic energy. She glided between linen-covered cocktail tables, her heavy diamond jewelry sparkling in the bright summer sun. Leaning in toward a cluster of wealthy friends, she lowered her voice and eagerly shared the details of their upcoming move. She bragged about the stunning oceanfront condo they planned to buy in Miami, painting a picture of an idyllic new life, bathed in endless sunshine and luxury. She told anyone who would listen that the Atlanta market was simply too small to contain Brandon's grand ambitions. When an older aunt asked why I was not attending the family gathering, Ashley let out a condescending smile. She sighed dramatically, claiming it was a heartbreak that some people just could not bear to see their own brother achieve massive financial success. She spun a venomous tale for the listening crowd, strongly implying that I was sitting alone in a dark apartment, consumed by bitter jealousy and completely isolated from a loving family. She told them it was a blessing I had not shown up, as my unstable temper would have ruined such a beautiful celebration. My parents, Thomas and Linda, were beaming near the outdoor bar, playing the ultimate proud, supportive parents. They accepted congratulations on their son's financial triumph, reveling in the social validation. They were so absorbed in this elaborate lie that they had no idea the very ground they were standing on no longer belonged to them. Raising their glasses to toast their brilliant son and daughter-in-law, they basked in the stolen victory, unaware that the true and sole owner of their estate was waiting just outside their property line. I turned away from the tinted window toward Daniel and Beatrice. The period of quiet observation was over. I signaled the driver to pull the van forward, stopping directly in front of the open iron gates leading to the wide backyard. The heavy vehicle rolled to a smooth halt, acting like a black steel barrier, blocking the main entrance. I pushed the door open and stepped out of the air-conditioned cabin. The heavy summer heat wrapped around my tailored dark charcoal suit. Daniel stepped out right behind me, holding the heavy leather briefcase tightly. Beatrice fell into step alongside my towering head of security. Together, we formed an unyielding wall of corporate authority against the soft pastels of the suburban party. With the deliberate, unhurried stride of a woman who held absolute power, I walked up the wide concrete driveway, stepped through the open iron gates, and walked directly onto the manicured green lawn of my parents' backyard. The social disruption was not immediate. It took a few seconds for the crowd to process what was happening. Guests standing near the entrance were the first to notice the group in dark suits. Their lively conversations died down, champagne glasses frozen in mid-air. A heavy silence began to ripple across the lawn. It spread rapidly from one table to the next as people turned to see what had caused the abrupt shift in atmosphere. Porch. The jazz quartet sensed the change, missed a note mid-phrase, and brought the music to an awkward halt. Dozens of curious eyes turned toward the gate. The sea of pastel clothing naturally parted, creating a direct path to the center of the backyard. Brandon, still holding his glass of scotch, noticed the dead silence and turned around. His arrogant laugh died on his lips. Porch. The color drained from his face instantly. Ashley froze mid-sentence, clapping her hand over her mouth as she recognized the woman she had spent all afternoon mocking. I stood at the edge of the patio in absolute silence, flanked by my legal team, looking down at the shocked crowd. Linda was the first to react. She pushed past two groups of guests and rushed to the edge of the patio. Porch. She wore a tight, forced smile that might have looked welcoming from a distance, but up close, held no warmth at all. Grabbing my elbow, she leaned in close and hissed through her teeth, her voice barely a whisper. "I told you not to come," she snarled. "Turn around and get out of here right now. Stop embarrassing us." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve until she awkwardly let go. Porch. Then I looked past her at the party she was so desperate to protect. The jazz band had stopped. Waiters stood like statues with their silver trays. Relatives who had spent the entire week spreading rumors about my mental state suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable. Linda tried again, her voice slightly louder this time. Porch. She urged that Ashley's friends did not need to see a family drama, adding that Brandon had barely recovered from the terrible things I had done to him. She told me that if I had any decency left, I would leave quietly and let everyone enjoy the afternoon. Before I could answer, Ashley stepped forward. Having recovered from the initial shock, her desire to humiliate me quickly took over. Porch. She raised her glass, looked around at the crowd, and smiled as if she had just been handed a spotlight. "Look, everyone," she announced loudly, "the trash collector finally decided to show up. Sorry, Camille, but we don't have any leftovers for you to haul away." A few of her country club friends let out forced laughs. Two relatives exchanged nervous glances. Porch. Hearing the reaction, Ashley's confidence surged. She claimed she had asked Brandon to keep the afternoon elegant, calling my arrival proof of why I had not been invited. According to her, even if I owned all the garbage trucks in Atlanta, I would never learn what it meant to have class. Linda turned to Ashley, ordering her to be quiet. Porch. It was not out of concern for the insult, but out of fear of an audience. Her eyes darted between the guests and my legal team, calculating which version of the family narrative would survive the afternoon. She pleaded under her breath for us to take this inside. I refused. Their decision to humiliate me had never been private. Porch. The cruel group message had been sent for everyone to see. The rumors had been spread through their social circles, and this party had been staged as proof that I was too embarrassing to be included. I was not about to hide the consequences behind closed doors. One of my uncles cleared his throat and asked awkwardly if this really needed to happen in front of everyone. I looked at him coldly. Porch. Did those vicious stories about my mental stability need an audience? He looked away. Another relative, who had responded with a laughing emoji under Brandon's message mocking me, suddenly became very interested in the melting ice in his glass. No one apologized. They simply stopped laughing the moment they realized the person they had mocked had arrived with proof, not excuses. Porch. Ashley mistook their silence for support. Raising her chin, she accused me of turning a family gathering into a corporate show, claiming it proved her point. She declared that truly successful people knew how to keep business separate from personal matters. I told her I agreed completely, which was precisely why I had brought legal counsel and official records instead of a family argument. Porch. This is no longer about whether you like my clothes, my job, or my presence at your party. This is a matter of ownership. I let the remaining chatter die down completely before looking straight at Brandon. His expression was the complete opposite of his wife's. He stood frozen near the outdoor kitchen, his glass of scotch still clutched in his hand, though he could no longer drink it. He knew I would not have driven 40 minutes just to trade insults. His eyes darted nervously between Daniel's briefcase, Beatrice, and the open gates behind us. "The truth is, Ashley," I began, my tone measured enough that the entire patio had to fall silent to hear me. "I came to take back what belongs entirely to me." I took a step forward onto the patio, making it clear what belonged to me so no one could pretend this was a vague threat. "That means all equity in the catering group that Brandon signed away. That means all digital records transferred with the business. That means the vendor contracts, operational databases, and commercial rights that were placed under Summit's control. It also means I have every right to challenge an illegal sale conducted after control had already been handed over." Brandon tried to interrupt, yelling that he had signed the papers under duress. Daniel stepped in as chief legal counsel before I even needed to speak. He calmly stated that the agreement had been executed inside Summit's corporate offices, fully witnessed and legally binding. After Brandon was informed that refusal would lead to complete creditor liquidation. Brandon had chosen to settle because it was the only way to keep the business operating and protect his employees from immediate termination. No amount of yelling at a party could change that written legal record. For the first time, several guests stopped looking at me as an intruder and started looking at Brandon as someone who had hidden critical facts in his victory story. Brandon set his glass down so hard that scotch splashed onto the granite counter. He demanded to know what I was talking about, trying to sound angry rather than terrified. I told him he knew better than anyone. Less than 24 hours ago, he used old credentials tied to a company he no longer owned to illegally transfer commercial assets to an out-of-state buyer. That buyer paid $800,000 for property he had no right to sell. An uneasy murmur broke out among the guests. Daniel opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents, including court filings, preservation notices, and emergency legal papers. He handed a copy to Brandon. The top page was an official notice confirming that Summit Facility Management was the sole legal owner of the catering group's equity and intellectual property, formally challenging any disposal of assets made after the transfer agreement. Brandon initially refused to take the packet, so Daniel set it on the outdoor bar right next to the abandoned glass of scotch. I turned to face the crowd. I did not need to air every detail of our family history. I simply gave them the undeniable facts. Summit had acquired Brandon's defaulted debt. Brandon had voluntarily signed an agreement transferring 100% ownership and operational assets to Summit. And after the transfer took effect, he used legacy credentials to log into the system and illegally sell the liquor license, proprietary vendor data, and client information to a Nevada investor and group for $800,000. Daniel pulled out a one-page transaction timeline and handed copies directly to the lead investor from the Nevada group and to my father, Thomas. The timeline was simple and easy to understand. The first line showed the exact time Brandon signed away the catering group. The next line logged the precise second his old credentials were used to access the server. Below that were the emails transferring the liquor license and data, the digital delivery logs, and finally the record of the $800,000 wire transfer leaving Nevada. The sequence exposed the lie that there had been any confusion over who owned the assets. The lead investor read the page twice, his face hardening. He sharply demanded to see the signature page on the equity transfer. Daniel produced a copy of the original document. Brandon's signature was clearly visible, stamped by a notary with the effective time. The investor looked up from the paper and stared at Brandon, asking why this had been hidden during their negotiations. Porch. Brandon scrambled for an excuse, claiming he thought the subsidiary assets were excluded from the deal. Daniel calmly turned to the attached schedule in the agreement and pointed directly to the name of the subsidiary. Brandon's excuse collapsed right in front of everyone. Porch. A local investor standing near the grill asked sharply if Brandon had lied to the people who had personally loaned him money as well. Brandon snapped back that the question made no sense. It was a terrible response. Two other guests began comparing notes on the promises Brandon had made over the past year. Porch. The tight circle of trust that had surrounded him at the start of the party dissolved into whispers of suspicion and anger. A few men standing near the tent stopped talking entirely. I recognized them from the due diligence records. Beatrice had reviewed that morning. They were the VIP guests Brandon had invited, representatives of the Nevada group. Porch. He had clearly wanted the people funding his escape to witness the social status he believed he had purchased. I looked directly at them. If your firm completed that transfer this afternoon, the assets you received are disputed property belonging to Summit. Our legal counsel has already secured all transaction records. The lead investor set his plate down. Porch. His confusion quickly turned into intense anger. He demanded to know if Brandon had concealed the equity transfer. Brandon launched into a rushed explanation, claiming there was a misunderstanding and that he had retained rights through a subsidiary. Porch. Daniel stated calmly that the signed agreement explicitly included all subsidiaries' interests and prohibited Brandon from disposing of any corporate property. Ashley interjected, screaming that this was just another corporate technical trick. She shouted at the investors that Brandon had built the business with his own hands, meaning he had every moral right to sell what he created. Porch. The lead investor turned to her, pointing out that moral rights meant nothing in the face of legally binding ownership documents. I let the argument quiet down before revealing the final piece of the puzzle that my parents had spent the week avoiding. And this was certainly not the first time Brandon used property that wasn't his to solve a personal cash crisis, I announced coldly. Porch. Thomas snapped his head up from the bar. I took a second document from Daniel and held it high enough for my father to see the familiar address at the top. I announced to the entire gathering that the collateral behind Brandon's final round of loans, the ones used to cover his restaurant's losses before his total default, was an attempted mortgage on the very property everyone was standing on. Porch. Thomas himself had told me in my office that he had never authorized that mortgage. The signature on the loan documents was not his. The impact on the family was immediate and devastating. Thomas strode across the patio and snatched the copy from my hand. Porch. He compared the signature on the document to the one on his driver's license, then looked at a copy of an old bank document Daniel had included in the packet. His hands began to shake. Staring directly at Brandon, he asked him point-blank if he had forged his signature. Brandon could not give a straight answer. Porch. He offered a panicked defense, claiming he had only been trying to protect the family's investments and that he had never intended for the house to actually be lost. That answer spoke for itself. Linda called out Brandon's name in a weak, fragile voice, as if begging him to take it back. Porch. Brandon told her that if the market had turned around, the restaurant's expansion would have covered all the debt. He claimed he just needed more time. I watched my mother's face as she was finally forced to see the difference between the good son she had defended and the man standing in front of her. Even then, she tried to excuse him, whispering that he must have been desperate. Porch. Desperate people can ask for help, I interrupted firmly. They do not have the right to forge permissions. Several relatives heard this. The Nevada investors heard it too. The revelation of the forged mortgage completely shifted the mood, stripping away the last comforting lie. This was not a wealthy older sister, picking on a struggling younger brother. Porch. Before Summit ever stepped in, Brandon had been prepared to risk his parents' home without their knowledge to cover his own failure. Relatives looked down into their glasses in silence. I continued. Brandon was not ruined by a jealous sister who wasn't invited to a cookout. His business collapsed under millions of dollars in debt he created himself. He misused company funds to maintain a lavish lifestyle. When that failed, he forged a mortgage on his parents' home. And when Summit legally took over the business, his response was to sell off assets he no longer owned across state lines. Brandon yelled that I was twisting everything, claiming the house paperwork was just a temporary financing arrangement, and that if anyone had asked Dad, he would have agreed. Thomas finally snapped. "You never asked me," he roared. The shout echoed across the yard, cutting far deeper than any insult Ashley had thrown. For a second, Brandon looked like the 30-year-old child they had spent a lifetime protecting. He cried out to Thomas, saying he did it all to save the restaurant, swearing that if Camille had not gotten involved, the loan would have been paid off. Thomas took a step forward, but the lead investor from Nevada moved past him, confronting Brandon directly. Slamming his plate onto a nearby table, the man demanded to know where the $800,000 had gone. He stated his firm had wired the funds based on Brandon's explicit claim that he had full control of the assets. Brandon tried to lower his voice, suggesting they discuss it in private. The investor refused instantly, stating there was no private discussion to be had when someone sells property they do not own. His partners joined in, one pulling out a phone to call their legal team, while another demanded an immediate, full refund. Ashley protested, screaming that the money was set aside for their move. That careless slip dropped the entire yard into dead silence. "Move," the investor repeated. Ashley realized what she had just let slip. She looked in horror at me, then at the guests who had been listening to her brag about Miami all afternoon. The victory party she had staged as proof of her success now looked like evidence of a planned escape. Brandon stepped between Ashley and the investor, denying that anyone was fleeing and claiming the Miami condo was just an investment idea. The lead investor asked coldly why the wire instructions had bypassed the catering group's standard corporate accounts to go directly into a private, offshore holding account. Brandon stood speechless, unable to offer a believable answer. Daniel stepped close to me and whispered that the final transaction logs had been fully preserved along with the rest of the evidence. I nodded. My goal in coming to the party was never to stage a dramatic arrest scene. It was to destroy my family's attempt to rewrite history before everyone caught up in the illegal deal learned the truth. Right on cue, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. At first, the noise was faint and people looked toward the street without moving. As the sirens grew louder, all conversation stopped. Ashley slowly lowered her glass. Brandon looked at me in pure panic. "What did you do?" he gasped. "I simply documented what you did," I replied calmly. Flashing police lights cut through the hedge, casting red and blue light across the white party tent. The Nevada investors stepped back, distancing themselves from Brandon. The guests who had crowded around to watch quickly backed away, leaving a wide-open space. A team of federal agents in tactical vests and accompanying local officers spoke briefly with legal counsel at the gate before walking up the driveway. They moved with professional control, locking on to Brandon, securing the immediate area, and ordering everyone else to step back as they moved to execute their warrant. Brandon's reaction was immediate and foolish. He backed away from the outdoor kitchen, glanced toward a side gate, and ran. He made it only a few yards. A caterer jumped out of the way as he ran across the grass. Two agents cut off his path before he reached the hedge line. One ordered him to stop. Brandon took another step forward, tried to change direction, and was promptly tackled near the hedge. They restrained him quickly, pulling his hands behind his back and clicking the cold handcuffs into place. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Thomas held onto the edge of the bar to keep his balance. Linda called out Brandon's name in a frail voice that was barely audible across the yard. One of the agents confirmed Brandon's identity and informed him calmly that he was under arrest in connection with an ongoing investigation into interstate wire fraud, adding that official charges and proceedings would be handled through formal legal channels. It was not out of sadness, but out of relief. The worst of the storm had passed. They had played their last hand and they had lost completely. Now I could begin the rest of my life. First, I had one last detail to record. Pulling out my phone, I dialed my attorney's number. "Robert, it's me. I want to add a no-contest clause to my estate plan. If anyone in my family tries to contest the estate or declare me incompetent in court, they will forfeit any right to challenge the charitable donations. I want to make sure they understand that coming after me will only leave them empty-handed." "Consider it done," Robert said. "Dolores, are you holding up all right?" I looked around the quiet house, taking in the photos of Harold and me, looking out at the rose garden where no one was telling me I was too old for hard work. "I am completely fine," I said, and for the first time in years, I meant every single word. 7 months later, I stood in my new kitchen, brewing coffee for two. The morning sun poured through the east-facing window, illuminating a space that was much smaller than my old house, but felt infinitely larger. 3 weeks after that final confrontation, I sold the family estate. It was not because I needed the money, but because I needed freedom. Every room in that old house had been haunted by ghosts, memories of people who had never truly loved me, and the memory of my former self, a woman who had confused financial support with maternal duty. My new home was a charming 2-bedroom cottage in the Willowbrook Gardens retirement community. It was not the cold, lifeless facility my family had researched, but a vibrant, independent living neighborhood. The residents here chose to live together for companionship and security, not because they had lost their independence. At 8 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. "Good morning, sunshine," Margaret Winters called out, using the spare key I had given her to step inside. Margaret, a 72-year-old retired teacher who lived 3 houses down, had become my closest friend in this new chapter. "Morning, Maggie," I replied, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs I had bought at a local pottery shop. "Ready for our trip?" 6 weeks after I moved in, we had started taking short day trips together. Today, we were driving to a small town 90 minutes away, known for its antique shops and bustling farmers market. These were simple pleasures, but after years of revolving my life around other people's demands, the simplicity felt revolutionary. "Did you catch the morning paper?" Maggie asked, taking a seat at my kitchen table. She unfolded a newspaper and pointed to a small blurb in the local news section. "Axel Patterson, 18, arrested for driving under the influence. Vehicle impounded." The article was only 3 sentences long, but it told a complete story. I felt nothing. There was no urge to call and offer bail, no guilt over not being there to clean up his mess, no lingering sense of responsibility. "Are you okay?" Maggie asked softly. She knew about my past, why I had moved here, and why I had cut ties with my family. "I am completely fine," I said, and it was the absolute truth. Reaching this peace had taken time. The first month after cutting ties had been the hardest. There were moments when I almost picked up the phone to call Livia, or reflexively set 4 places at the table instead of 1. 66 years of habit do not vanish overnight. Gradually, the silence stopped feeling empty and began to feel peaceful. A life free from endless emergencies stopped feeling strange and became my new normal. Making my own choices without managing everyone else's reactions no longer felt selfish, it felt healthy. "Have you heard anything from your daughter?" Maggie asked as we gathered our things. "She stopped calling about 2 months ago," I said, grabbing my purse and coat. "I think she finally realized I wasn't going to change my mind." There had been a few desperate attempts at reconciliation early on. Around my 67th birthday in January, Livia had sent a card with a long letter attached. claiming she now saw how wrong they had been, how much they missed me, and how they had learned their lesson. Arch. Yet the letter was filled with subtle hints about their current financial struggles, carefully suggesting that perhaps I could offer a little help while they got back on their feet. I had dropped it straight into the trash without replying. Quentin tried a more direct approach by showing up at my old house, only to discover I had already sold it. Arch. The new owner gave him my attorney's contact information, and Robert Chen made it crystal clear. Any further attempt to contact me would be treated as unlawful harassment. Axel, on the other hand, did absolutely nothing. No phone calls, no letters, not a single attempt at an apology. In a strange way, his silence was the most honest reaction of all. Arch. He had never actually seen me as a human being, just a living bank account. Once I stopped serving that purpose, I simply ceased to exist to him. Honestly, I was completely fine with that. Maggie and I drove through the countryside, passing farms and dense woods that were just beginning to show their vibrant autumn colors. Arch. She talked about her grandchildren, real grandchildren, the kind who called just to hear her voice rather than to ask for cash, who came to visit because they genuinely enjoyed her company, brought home drawings from school, and stayed for lunch simply to spend time together. You know what I finally realized? I said, as we pulled into the farmer's market parking lot. Arch. I spent so much time grieving the family I wished I had that I never allowed myself to build the life I actually wanted. So, what do you want now? Maggie asked. I thought about it as we strolled past the crowded vendor stalls, passing displays of fresh vegetables, homemade jams, and handcrafted jewelry. I want to matter to someone, I said softly. Arch. Not because of what I can give them, but simply for who I am. And do you matter to someone now? Arch. I looked around at the bustling market, at the vendors who called me by name to ask how my week was going, at the friendly faces I had gotten to know over the past few months, and finally at Maggie, the woman who had invited me into her book club, her walking group, and brought me along to volunteer at the local animal shelter. Yes, I said, I matter to myself. Arch. And as it turns out, that is more than enough. We spent the rest of the morning wandering through antique shops. We were not looking to buy anything in particular, just enjoying the old photographs, vintage jewelry, and the stories behind furniture built to outlast the people who once owned it. Arch. I picked up a small wooden box once meant for holding letters, thinking it would be perfect for storing my journal entries as I documented this new life. Over lunch at a quiet little cafe, Maggie asked the one question I had been expecting for months. Do you ever regret it? I mean, completely cutting ties with them? Arch. I looked at the other diners around us as I ate my soup, giving the question the honest thought it deserved. There were couples holding hands across small tables, families sharing easy, unforced laughter, and people who genuinely enjoyed being near one another. I only regret that it was necessary, I said finally. Arch. I regret that the people I loved most in this world viewed me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. I regret spending so many years making excuses for the inexcusable. I paused, then added, but I don't regret protecting myself for 1 second. I don't regret choosing my own happiness over their convenience. Arch. And I certainly don't regret discovering how beautiful life can be when it actually belongs to me. On the drive home, I told Maggie about a letter I had received from the Children's Hospital the week before. They had used a portion of my donation to build a new playroom in the pediatric wing. Arch. They even sent photos of children fighting severe illnesses, kids who still found a reason to smile, laugh, and play. That money is doing something truly meaningful now, I said. It's bringing pure joy to children who desperately need it, instead of funding entitled adults who think the world owes them a living. Your husband would be so proud of you, Maggie said gently. Arch. I thought of Harold, the man who had loved me unconditionally for 44 years and never once made me feel like my worth was tied to my bank account. If he could see me now, living in a home filled with peace instead of tension, surrounded by friends who chose my company rather than relatives who merely tolerated my existence. I knew he would be smiling with total approval. That evening, as I sat in my favorite armchair, reading a book purely for pleasure rather than out of obligation, my phone rang. For a split second, my heart skipped a beat, expecting bad news from my past. But the caller ID displayed the number for the Willowbrook Gardens Community Center. Dolores, it's Nancy from the front office. We're still looking for someone to help coordinate the Thanksgiving gift drive for the local women's shelter. Would you be interested? Ever since moving in, I had taken on more volunteer work. Using my time this way felt deeply fulfilling, a far cry from the exhausting obligations of my past. The gift drive involved sorting donated items, coordinating with shelter staff, and helping deliver gifts to women and children who were starting over after leaving dangerous situations. These women, much like myself, had learned that sometimes walking away from what you thought was home is the bravest thing you can possibly do. I would love to help, I said. After hanging up, I walked over to the window and looked out at the small garden I had started in the backyard of my cottage. It was nowhere near as grand as the landscaping Harold and I had built at the old house, but these flowers belonged strictly to me. I planted them, cared for them, and watched them grow without anyone making cruel comments in my ear. Tomorrow, I would start planning the Thanksgiving drive. Next week, Maggie and I were taking another short trip, maybe to visit that art museum she kept talking about. Next month, I would host a holiday dinner for my friends from the book club, creating fresh traditions rooted in genuine connection rather than obligation, guilt, or financial manipulation. I had no idea how my family planned to spend the holidays. I did not know if Axel had learned anything from his DUI arrest, or if Livia and Quentin had figured out how to survive without my $8,000 monthly checks. I did not know if they ever thought of me, missed me, or if they had already moved on to find another source of funds to drain. And for the very first time in my 67 years, I simply did not care. I was finally living for myself. I had friends who valued my voice, activities that kept me energized, and a future wide open with possibilities instead of heavy burdens. My mind drifted back one last time to Axel's cruel remark that had set all of this in motion. The best birthday gift you could ever give me is to hurry up and pass away so we can split your money. In a funny way, he had been right. The woman who lived only to satisfy their demands, the woman who confused financial handouts with love, the woman who kept paying out cash to buy a sliver of hollow affection. That woman really was gone. Reborn from her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more grounded. A woman who finally understood that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you build with yourself. Standing in my own kitchen, inside my own home, surrounded entirely by my own choices, I raised my coffee mug to the woman I had become. Happy birthday to me, I said aloud to the quiet room, a room that felt fuller and warmer than any crowded family gathering ever had. And deep down, I was absolutely certain that somewhere out there, Harold was smiling.